interesting conversation, right? My name is Isa Le, and I'm the executive director of the Vietnamese American Arts and Letters Association, VAALA, Hội Văn học Nghệ thuật Việt Mỹ. First of all, I'd like to thank you for being here today on a Sunday, and also thank you so much for, I know that I see a lot of familiar faces, so you have been to VAALA's events, but this is probably not the first time, but it's been a while that we have a pleasure to co-host this event with DVAN, and today the program is live on social media, so please tell your friends who are not here, please follow us on social media. So first of all, I'd like to say a little bit about VAALA. VAALA is a non-profit organization that was established in 1991 by a group of journalists, Vietnamese American journalists and artists. And our mission is to connect and enrich the communities through Vietnamese art and culture. And we do that by producing artistic events like the annual Viet Film Fest, Viet Book Fest, which just happened a few weeks ago, and Viet was there. We also have youth programs like the Youth Emotion Filmmaking Workshop, and also we have exhibitions every year. So please follow us on our Instagram or VAALA community or Facebook, and our website is vaala.org. So without further ado, I would like to introduce a very special person. She's the board member of VAALA. She's been with VAALA since forever, I think 2010. So please welcome Dr. Thuy Phỏ Đăng.
Thank you, Teresa. Wow, may the 4th be with you. Thank you all for being here today. We know how important these types of conversations are for our community. 50 years, 5 decades of diaspora is a milestone that we really need to observe with a sense of not just the importance of anniversary dates, but with the sense of how much work our cultural producers, the artists, the writers, the journalists, the photographers, how much work they've done to increase awareness of the stories that are embedded in our community. So this is one of the reasons why I've been with VAALA for almost 15 years. VAALA builds a platform so that the generations in our community will have a platform and a bridge to be able to start conversations in their own households, to be able to explore and think deeply about the things that have hurt us and have divided us, and hopefully work towards healing. So my role today as a memory worker is to also remind everyone that journalists, which you will have an example of on stage today through our wonderful moderator, photographers and writers are all memory workers as well. They help us maintain a sense of who we are so that 100 years from now, when none of us in this room are around, our grandchildren, great-grandchildren will remember that we were here and that we made an impact. So my role is to introduce Thanh Tan, who is a Vietnamese-American storyteller, filmmaker, and cultural worker based in Seattle. An award-winning journalist, her work has appeared on This American Life, the New York Times, and the Texas Tribune. She created the podcast Second Wave about the post-war Vietnamese refugee experience and co-founded Viet Fact Check to fight misinformation and disinformation in our community. For those of you who don't know what Viet Fact Check is, please look it up. It's creating really vital resources for all of us. In 2021, she launched Viets for Afghans and made her directorial debut with Refuge After War, a docuseries on Vietnamese and Afghan refugees. A part of the series was screened at VAALA's Viet Film Fest in 2023. Thanh has led global storytelling for Microsoft and Starbucks and is a sought-after moderator on Asian diaspora and culture. She co-founded C Vinyl Society and is curating Vietnam's Golden Music Archive, a 2025 exhibit at King Street Station. She's also behind We Were Soldiers Too, a photo exhibit honoring South Vietnamese veterans, and is currently directing her first feature documentary, Che's Last Stand. I'm so excited and honored to welcome our moderator to the stage. Please join me in welcoming Thanh Tan.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm from Seattle, so it's always great to come back to Southern California. I went to USC, and hello. I feel like I brought the weather with me, though. Without further ado, I'm going to bring our two speakers up on stage today, and I'm going to start with Annie Lê. Can you please join us? Annie Lê. Annie Lê is an internationally acclaimed photographer and a MacArthur Fellow, also known as MacArthur Geniuses. Her images explore aftershocks of war, the landscapes of power, and the tension between documentary and staged memory. Her photographs have been exhibited at places like MoMA in New York City, and her work has been published in a number of books that are incredible and large and heavy. Thank you for being with us. And next I'd like to introduce Viet Thanh Nguyen. Please join us. He is a Pulitzer Prize-winning author of The Sympathizer. He's also written many other books. He is also a MacArthur Genius Fellow and a leading voice on war, memory, and identity. His most recent, before his latest book that is displayed up here, he wrote a memoir this past year, A Man of Two Faces. And Viet, thank you for being here. You've taught many of us, both of you actually are professors. So not only are you creating original work yourself, but you're also making sure that we've got a new generation coming up behind you as well. So thank you both for being here. I thought we would start off a little bit today. First of all, a little bit of a confession. I feel like Viet, when you came to Seattle, Viet, I drove you back to your hotel and I bumped into another car and it was really embarrassing. And today, while I was walking in, I ate the cement and I fell. I fell and my mouth really hurts. I've skinned myself a little bit, so excuse if you're like, that moderator looks like her mouth is weird. I literally just fell outside, so Viet, you're really good luck for me. But anyway, so forgive me. I thought I would kind of ground us a little bit today. We're here to hear you two in conversation with each other and also with the audience. I think we will also take some audience Q&A. Most important, we have books by not just these two, but by other Vietnamese authors that are for sale in the hallway, and you two will be available after our talk today to sign everyone's books. So make sure you're supporting our Vietnamese artists because we can't do our work without your support. But I thought I would ground us today in a song and a little bit of music. Moderator's prerogative. I brought a collection of Vietnamese vinyl records. It is a weird hobby obsession that I have, that I collect vinyl records that were made and recorded before 1975. And I wanted to play a song called Den Winko, which is a nightly prayer. And it's a reminder, I think, for us that we are here today to talk about memory and identity and what we've learned over the last 50 years. But let's ground ourselves in a moment in the sounds that our people were listening to during war. I like to think of this as the music that brought my parents and also you two, you were very young in Vietnam, brought perhaps you two a sense of a coping mechanism in the midst of chaos and violence. This song is by Lê Minh Bang, which is a trio of songwriters, and it's sung by a soldier who is actually praying for peace at the front lines. Some of you may recognize the song, but I invite you all to join me and just try to calm down for a second, because I'm still kind of like a little stressed from that fall. But just let's listen in community and then we'll begin our discussion. How does that sound? Okay.
phương trần ai. Có những lúc tiếng chuông đến đêm vọng về rừng sâu. Dưng dưng tôi chắp tay nghe hồn khóc đến rướm máu. Bâng khuâng nghe súng vang trong sầu. Tình nào cho non nước trôi chẳng là lũ sâu. Vâng đế ơi có thấu cho Việt Nam này nhiều sóng gió trôi dạt lâu dài. Từng chiến đấu tiêu diệt quân bao tầng. Vâng đế ơi hãy lắng nghe người dân hiền vì đất nước đang còn ưu tiên. Còn tiếng khóc đi vào đêm chiến. Có những lúc tiếng chuông đêm đêm vọng về rừng sâu. Dưng dưng tôi chắp tay nghe hồn khóc đến rớm máu. Quê hương non nước tôi ai gầy vật. Nhà Việt Nam yêu dấu ơi bao giờ đây. Có những lúc tiếng chuông đêm đêm vọng về rừng sâu. Dưng dưng tôi chắp tay nghe hồn khóc đến rướm máu. Quê hương non nước tôi ai gầy hận tội. Nhà Việt Nam yêu dấu ơi bao giờ đây. Nam yêu dấu ơi.
Does anybody here know that song? A quick translation, Night of Prayer. Please listen to the voice echoing deep within your soul. A true heart never knows how to lie. I've marched through endless years of war tirelessly, and my soul carries wounds, wounds of a life filled with suffering. There are nights when the sound of bells echoes through the jungle. Tears rise as I clasp my hands in prayer, my soul bleeding in sorrow. Troubled, I hear gunfire in the misty distance. I bow my head in grief, overwhelmed by the thousand sorrows of my homeland. O Lord, do you see the pain of my Vietnam? So long it has drifted amid storms and hardships. We fought to destroy the cruel, violent enemy. O Lord, please listen to your gentle people, for our land is still burdened with sorrow, still filled with cries that echo endlessly into the night. There are nights when the sound of bells echo through the jungle. Tears rise as I clasp my hands in prayer, my soul bleeding in sorrow. O homeland, who planted hatred and caused such sin? Beloved home of Vietnam, when will peace return? That's how they processed war as it was going on back then. You two have done so much work that it's hard to even know where to begin. You've been processing the Vietnam War over the last 50 years, and you've been making the rounds. You've spoken to a lot of different communities. I think you're here in Orange County, where we have a very large Vietnamese community, largest outside of Vietnam. I'm just curious, how are you doing as you are being asked to lead and to process what 50 years means to the world, 50 years after the end of the Vietnam War? How are you doing?
First this time? No, we were just in conversation literally on April 26th about some similar issues. You were there too, Thanh. First of all, I just want to congratulate VAALA. I think this is the first Vietnamese event I've ever been to in my entire life that actually started on time. Congratulations. It's sort of like, being Vietnamese is always about being late. That's my association with being Vietnamese. We're always late. We really don't care what the time is, and we'll just show up 2 hours late to a wedding, and then we'll just party on and on and on and on. And it's it's related to this song because I think that the lyrics are actually very sad, obviously, and as you said, the song is being done in wartime, but the feel of the music is different to me, because I grew up in a Vietnamese refugee community in the 1970s and 1980s. The only music I ever heard that was Vietnamese Catholic music and Paris by Night. Somehow those two things could exist in the same household. But even though the songs were oftentimes very sad in their content, the feeling was not just sadness. It was also melancholy, it was longing, it was nostalgia, there was love, there was romance. When I hear a song like that, I hear the crack and the crackle and the pop of the vinyl. I think about the fact that we Vietnamese people, besides liking to suffer, we love to suffer, we also love to drink and smoke and hang out and go to nightclubs, and all of that is wrapped up in this very complicated emotional package. And if all those emotional strands are impossible to disentangle one from the other. That was my set of feelings when I was growing up. And it's still true today. I'll give you two examples. One is that maybe some of you are watching this new Netflix documentary series called Turning Point. It's on the war in Vietnam. It's another one of these landmark documentaries. I hate these landmark documentaries. I did not watch the Ken Burns documentary from about nine years ago because I was tired of this whole subject. But this one I started to watch because I'm in it. So I watched the first hour and a half or so, and I'm very analytical in it. Okay, I'm talking about what is my analysis of the Vietnam War? How did the U.S. end up there? What does it mean for the Vietnamese Americans and for the victorious Vietnamese and so on? So I'm very analytical in there. But there were some pictures of my family and so on, and I'm talking about some of these same issues. And then just on Thursday night, I was in New York City being interviewed by Hoa Xu, this writer, about To Save and to Destroy, this most recent book, and he started to ask me about the very things I was talking about. The fact that my family came in 1975, we ended up as refugees in San Jose, California. They opened this grocery store called the Saigon Mai. The moment I said those words, the Saigon Mai, I just sort of was overcome by emotion. So I was very analytical in the documentary because I had to be, but in front of all these people, talking about my parents, talking about their grocery store, it was as if no time had elapsed. And that even though my parents, their suffering and all that kind of stuff is over, the emotional residue is still inside of me. And I was only 4 years old when I came, so I can only imagine how much feeling still stays embedded in all those people who were in their teens and in their adulthoods when they were experiencing the Vietnam War. How can we expect anybody to really forget? There's a whole set of complicated questions around what does reconciliation mean between countries, between the homeland and the diaspora and so on. But for individuals who have been through history and have encountered things and seen things with their own eyes, lost people, lost their country, it's impossible, I think, to ever truly forget. And the memory is not just rational, it's not just things that we can construct as a story, it's actually embedded in very inarticulate ways emotionally, and those feelings are always waiting there to surprise us, I think. And so the past truly is never past.
Maybe I'll jump back a little bit to the relationship between memories and music. For me, it was a real mixture of different influences. I think I remember more positively hearing or waiting with my brother who's here for the armed forces hour of rock and roll music to start every day at a particular time. Maybe it was 3 p.m. or some strange time like that. And we turn on the radio and we get an hour of the latest songs. And that was exciting to us. In the meantime, in terms of Vietnamese music, my parents were teachers, so we lived in this apartment complex for teachers. The front was open and the back was open, and right after lunch, we'd be bombarded with cải lương. So it's like nap time, but Vietnamese love to nap, hearing cải lương in the background. So it's kind of very whiny, dramatic, and couldn't make sense out of it, but that's Vietnam and the chaos of Vietnam. In terms of appreciation of Vietnamese music, it came when I was away from Vietnam. So I had a few years where I lived in Paris with my grandmother, and she would be locked up in the kitchen, and this was before we were in Paris, and this was before there was any Vietnamese food in Vietnam, and she would be trying to recreate these Vietnamese dishes, smoking, listening to Trịnh Công Sơn, and I have to say I couldn't really understand the lyrics, but it had all those rhythms of nostalgia, sadness, and very poetic music, and that stays with me, and I listen to it today, and I think about my grandmother, I think about Vietnam, and it's very emotional. In terms of my work, I have to say that I started being a photographer purely for the love of photography. And I think it was only slowly that I used photography to try to understand what that defining moment was, you know, a defining moment for me, for Viet, and trying to make sense of the war, trying to make sense of losing the country and being taken away. So those two things are kind of inseparable. I think that perhaps being able to reconnect with the country when I was able to return to Vietnam, trying to understand what really happened in this kind of geopolitical plan that, you know, we were not part of and could not really contribute to, that we were sort of victims of. In terms of making sense out of that, I think for sure there was some sort of personal growth from learning and from experiencing and asking questions, but I think it only made sense to me in the company of the photographs. And so identity, photography, also teaching, being a parent, being a daughter, being a sister, all of those things I think were kind of all went in unison for me, and it's kind of hard to parse. And you know, I think that I have a kind of clarity today, or maybe I'm wiser about what happened, but it's still very emotional and very thoughtful. But I understand that the younger generations of Vietnamese are affected differently. They were younger. Many of them are born here, of course, and so it doesn't affect them in the same way. But I think it is an important part of our heritage.
I think I was born after the war, and I think there's something about the number 50, and I just wonder, in a historical sense, what does 50 years mean compared to, you know, every year everybody remembers Thanh Tan or Ba Mươi Tháng 4, Ngày Quốc Hận. It means something different for everyone. 25 years, 20 years, 10 years, these markers come up. Is there something about 50 years? Is it a unique amount of time removed from the trauma to be able to pull out new observations? Is there anything, I mean, what is it about 50 years from a historical or artistic perspective that you think we can pull out now that maybe we couldn't have before this? And that's a question for either of you.
Well, I think it's really incredibly symbolic. 50 years for me marks a whole shift of generations that has taken place. I mean, there are still people who obviously lived through the war period who are still alive, but I think their place in power has drastically declined. 25 years, 30, 40 years, I mean, there were still people who lived through that era who were still in power at that point, but not really now. And I'm a professor, so I actually just finished teaching my class on the American War in Vietnam, and almost all of my students are born after 9/11. Okay, so for them, literally now 50 years after the end of the war, this war is history for them, literally history. And if you're an American, history is ancient history. There's no difference, okay? So there is such a huge gap now between lived memory of the generations who went through it, who are now, I think, the guardians of memory. They're a part of a fading generation now. And the fact that this generation today is on its own. It is on its own in terms of what the Vietnam War or the American War in Vietnam means. And I think that's really crucially important, because what that means for me as someone who studies the war and has written about it is that this whole idea that the Vietnam War was a bad war, which is, I think, felt by a lot of Americans and by some Vietnamese people, that is no longer true at the level of governments. at the level of the government, of American presidents, let's say, all American presidents, Democratic or Republican, have sought to say that this was a good war, this was a noble war, but flawed. We didn't win, obviously, as Americans, but it was a noble war. That, at the level of the presidency, the military-industrial complex, the State Department, the Defense Department, that has triumphed. And that is bad. That is bad. Because with the fading of that generation who actually lived and fought in the war, this memory, that this was a noble but flawed war, is dominant now at the level of state and warcraft. And that is how we got into Iraq and Afghanistan. We learned all the wrong lessons as Americans from the war in Vietnam, from my perspective. The lesson we should have learned: don't meddle in other people's countries and other people's wars of liberation and independence. Let the Vietnamese determine their own future, whatever that future is. The American government never learned that lesson. So now we went to Iraq, we went to Afghanistan, we messed up these countries, killed a lot of people, hundreds of thousands of people. We're supporting Israel in Palestine. History will judge us very badly for this, I think. And so we learned all the wrong lessons. And that's partly what it means to celebrate a 50th anniversary. The people who could tell us that we learned the wrong lessons are no longer really able to as forcefully as they once could.
50 years is half a century. It's huge, and I can't believe that we're sitting here active. And yeah, I think 50 years is allows you to have incredible perspective. And I think as an individual, I think I've gotten wiser and learned something. So it's terrifying to be reminded by Viet that you know, the American government has not learned its lessons. I remember the day we invaded Iraq, March 2003. I was not ready, and I think when I read the headlines in the news, I was in shock. And of course, there were no Vietnamese involved, but I thought of the young American men and women who were being sent off to war. And it was devastating, and I started this body of work. I wanted to go to Iraq, I couldn't go. So I photographed young American men and women training in 29 towns outside of LA, because it was just unconscionable to me to think that we were getting into something else so complicated, and it turned out to be even more complicated than we could imagine. But it came from, you know, thinking about us still trying to process Vietnam, thinking about the American vets who had such a hard time adapting, and then seeing these young men and women who could be my students, you know, going off to war, young kids with incredible potential, so ideal, and just being sent off to something devastating. So I don't know what it means, and I think we may be getting into something else. So it's important to be reminded that war is devastating, and I think we can decide who we vote for on how we could help mitigate the situation.
This is also, I think it's about the power of story too, though. It's like you have to hear from people who've experienced war so that we can try to learn the lessons from it. Because I think if we don't have the experience, sometimes that's how you get into, I mean, we are increasingly sliding into an authoritarian society right now because many of us don't know what it was like, or don't know what it's like to live in a country where you don't have complete freedom of speech and freedom to go about. So, I mean, I want to ask you, your photos, they often depict reenactments and remnants of war. And you don't take photos of war itself. And can you tell us what draws you to that sort of art form and that as a subject, and what you think your photographs reveal that direct depictions of war do not?
Yeah, so I should explain that I'm not a photojournalist, not because I'm not interested, and I admire the profession. I think it's so hard to do that kind of work. You know, it's partly out of practicality. You know, I have family, I teach. I'm interested in using a camera that's kind of clunky and big. And so it doesn't really make sense to photograph unfolding combat. It's not that I would have tried it and actually did want to go to Iraq, and I would have certainly figured out a way to photograph combat. But because of circumstances, you know, I ended up finding not real combat, but training for combat as the next best option to photograph. And it kind of became my MO, you know, because I realized that sometimes, and we're surrounded by pictures of war and news, and so there's room for something that's kind of not about the immediate action, that's about preparation, it's about the aftermath, it's about the side view of things. And I think that perspective can be very interesting, and I think it's about providing a different point of view, a different perspective to something that we think we know so well. I should also say that, you know, my pictures are, I hope that my pictures they each kind of stand alone. I hope people stand in front of them. They're large, they're full of details, that people spend time with each picture. You know, today we're bombarded with photographs on Instagram, and we just swipe, and we just, you know, they're all beautiful, but we move on to the next. And I think that my pictures require a little bit more time. You need to slow down, and perhaps you look at the experience that is provided, and maybe you'll think about war in a different way than you haven't thought about it. It's not just devastation, it's about people who are affected by it. It's about the military-industrial complex. It's about preparation, it's about the consequences. You know, we're still dealing with consequences.
You two have been in one another's orbit quite a bit over the years. You're both MacArthur geniuses. I don't know what that actually means. And you've been recognized for illuminating the complexities of our experience. How has the recognition, being called geniuses, how has that shaped your sense of responsibility or your freedom as artists?
Well, first of all, I mean, I'm not a genius. That's the first thing you should do when people bring this up. If I say I am, then they're like, oh, no, you're not. No, but it's like, I mean, it's complicated. I think that, you know, we've both been lucky well, I think I've been lucky anyway, to be the recipient of various kinds of prizes and awards. And every time I get one, I don't think that, oh, I need to work harder to get another one. I think, I've gotten these prizes, they're going to let me speak up, and I should take advantage of that and say exactly what I want to say, which is how I got these prizes in the first place. So they're not really freeing. They just you know, provide further affirmation that people will now listen because of these things that accumulate. But I don't think I never became a writer because I wanted prizes. I became a writer because I believe in the art, and I believe in trying to be absolutely authentically true to whatever I think my internal voice happens to be. And then if other people recognize it, and you know, our society likes to give prizes and likes to talk about prizes, which has nothing to do with the art. It's weird, but I have to take advantage of that. Okay, so there's that preface. But you know, when I got the MacArthur Foundation grant, which is a lot of money, I believe, I don't know what you got for yours, but mine was $620.
Less than you.
Okay, so
it kept increasing.
Right, but let's be fair. Yours might have been $500,000. I don't know. Mine was $625,000. This last couple of years has been like $800,000. So I'm like, they could have waited a couple of years to give me money. But it was actually really important, and I'm not the only one who's done this, but there's been a number of other MacArthur Fellows. We don't just take the money and go out and buy a Lamborghini, okay? I wanted to, but I didn't do it. So, I mean, I used part of that money to help fund the Diasporic Vietnamese Artists Network, which is my 501c3. And this is based out of this idea that, and this is important for all of us in this room, I think, that for people like us, you know, when we become successful as minority artists, sometimes there's a label put on us, and it's literally been put on me, a voice for the voiceless. You've heard this one before, right? And of course, if you're Vietnamese, you're like, what? Vietnamese people are voiceless? I never knew that. You know, like, we're really, really loud. But I go back to Aaron Thanh Nguyen's notion, you know, that there is no such thing as the voiceless. There's only the deliberately silenced or the preferably unheard. And I think that totally describes the situation of Vietnamese refugees in the United States. We're really loud. We've always been telling stories. We've always been making music. We've always been publishing newspapers, and we've always been trying to kill each other. We're really, really loud. But the rest of American society doesn't want to hear Vietnamese people unless we speak in terms that American society can understand, which is to say, in English. So I'm very deeply aware of the contradiction that I find myself in, that I'm a colonized subject, I'm a racialized subject, that I speak and write in English, which distances me from the Vietnamese community that speaks and writes in Vietnamese. But speaking and writing in English, my colonizer's language, has allowed me access to the mechanisms of production and reproduction of our colonizing society. But I don't want to be a voice for the voiceless, so my friends and I, we created, back when we were college students, our own, one of the very first Vietnamese American arts organizations, which we called, and I take credit for the name, Ink and Blood. Muk Vam Ao. Very melodramatic and therefore very Vietnamese. And that's become the more, socially acceptable Diasporic Vietnamese Artists Network, which is good for raising money. But the whole point of that, like in this room, we're here not to have voices for the voiceless, but to try to, in our own small way, abolish the conditions of voicelessness, to try to create more opportunities for Vietnamese people to speak up and to be heard, especially the younger generation, who hopefully will not grow up feeling that they have to talk about the war in Vietnam. If they want to, that's great. If they don't want to, that's their right. And we should, as a Vietnamese American community, totally welcome this whole new diversity of voices and stories that are emerging. So that's what the MacArthur really meant for me. I got very lucky to receive it as an individual, but it was so important to share the award because what I write about is about our entire community.
Thank you.
Trying to process everything you've said. When I was in graduate school in photography, I met Huy Sang Thong, the poet and translator. And I think he was the first Vietnamese American to receive the MacArthur. And he's very eccentric. And we had lunch on the greens in New Haven. He brought his sandwich, I brought my sandwich, and we just sat on the bench. We talked about the Tale of Kieu, which he translated. And then, I don't know why he started talking about the MacArthur, which he had received perhaps the year before. And he said, it just allows me to keep on working. And it hasn't changed me. You could get it, all right, and we just started talking about other things. And it just seemed so unreal that, he made it so casual. I never thought about it again until I received it, and I know it's a big deal, and I can't say that it was the defining award that I got. I think the Guggenheim Fellowship was probably much more meaningful to me because I was just starting out. It seemed that the work I had made in Vietnam was sort of acknowledged, but it seemed most people didn't really understand because it didn't look like pictures of Vietnam they'd seen in the press before. So somehow getting the Guggenheim Fellowship, and it was a fair amount of money, maybe it was $40,000, and it allowed me to travel to Vietnam and continue my work. That was really important, and it gave me a kind of confidence vote that was much needed. But the MacArthur was like another big step because, like Viet said, it's $500,000, 5 years where you could work without really worrying about money. And I think what really saved me in terms of dealing with what it means, what the obligations are, the pressure, all those questions that one asks when one gets this very prestigious award. The MacArthur sends a kind of video team to your studio, to your house, about maybe a month and a half before it's announced publicly, and they do this kind of video introduction of you. And the video crew was really great, and the guy who was directing the crew just started, asking me casual questions and everything. He said, oh, by the way, I was just interviewing this other writer, and he said something like, well, we do our work, and so what does getting the MacArthur mean? It means you continue doing your work, and but then when you go out to dinner, instead of ordering 1 glass of wine, you can order 2. And that just really helped me. and I never thought about the pressure, I never thought about anything else, because yes, he's right. I've been doing the work, and Viet's been doing his work, and we just now have the ability to show our work more, and our work is more accessible to other people. But it gave me the confidence, I think, to really become a better teacher. I think that before that, when I taught photography, it was always, okay, I'm teaching the skills, and I know this, I can help you figure out how you want to do it, but I never injected anything that I had learned personally about making work, because I used to think, oh, it's just about me, why should they care? They will figure out their own way. And actually, I did know things that could be helpful to my students, and I did know how to direct them, and how to kind of give them confidence that, it's okay not to know where you're going, it's okay to make mistakes, I've made many mistakes, I'm not perfect, and look at where I am, something like that, So that was extremely helpful. So I think that way of contributing back to the community of students, to other Vietnamese artists I've met is very meaningful.
And you don't apply for this, right? The MacArthur?
You cannot apply.
You just get the call.
Just get a phone call like, oh my God. Yeah, it's pretty amazing. So.
It's shocking. Where were you when you got the call?
I had just come back from some international trip, and I got a phone call, and I recognized the zip code, or not the area code, as Chicago, and MacArthur is in Chicago. It's like 206 or something like that. And I was like, oh, I don't know anybody in Chicago, so this might be what it is, and it, in fact, turned out to be that.
Yeah, I was upstairs from the classroom where I teach at Bard, getting ready to go to class, and I got the call. And my ears started buzzing, like I couldn't even process what the man was saying. And I said something like, but I'm interested in conflict. Why would you, about the military? Because somehow, photographing the military, some people misunderstand it, they think I support the military or support war. It just seemed very odd to me that, I would receive that.
Well, I think they're very good judges of art, so it's not they're not going to look at your work reductively, right?
Of course, which is, to their credit, yeah. But in my head, it was just, and I couldn't teach. I think I went to class, and I could not hear anything my students were saying. It's a 3-hour class, and my ears were buzzing the whole time. Yes, and of course, then they tell you you can't tell anybody except your partners or your family for whatever time.
And it's a pretty small club of Vietnamese MacArthur Fellows, right? I didn't even know about the Tale of Q author or translator.
There's a woman who's an expert in explosive work, yes, who's a chemist. And I've been trying to meet her to know about. And we have Ocean Long.
Right. Oh, I didn't know about the woman who, does she build bombs?
Yes.
I think I know of her, yeah.
She lives in New Mexico.
Wow.
I think she may be retired now.
Okay.
Wow, okay. Annie, I also want to ask you about, and speaking of your photography and photographs of American soldiers, reenactments, Vietnam War reenactments, you sometimes place yourself in it, sometimes you're not in it. And I'm just curious if you see yourself as a witness, as a participant, or something else entirely in your art.
I think it's a mixture of everything. As a photographer, I experienced something, and I made a photograph that may not necessarily reproduce the exact experience I had, but it produces another experience for the viewer. And whatever it takes, whether I'm directing a picture or just receiving the picture because it's so perfect, whether I have to perform in it, and it's often out of utilitarian reason more than because I like performing art. I performed in some of those photographs because there were no other Asian women available. So it's a mixture, whatever it takes.
And I think it comes back to being selected for the MacArthur. You two are basically just focusing on your craft. And I just wonder, for others of us who have passions, like, how do you define your craft? How did you define your craft? And how did you get so good at it?
30 years of misery. I think when it comes to writing, I think there is a mystery. There is a mystery. There's something that can't be explained that comes inside of yourself. But there's much of the writing is actually not mysterious at all. I really love Haruki Murakami's book, What We Talk About When We Talk About Running. It's about his, he's a famous Japanese writer, but he's also a marathon runner. He runs all the time, and in that book he just talks about running. But obviously the metaphor is, it's just like writing, literally one step in front of the other, over and over and over again, and it never ends. If you're a marathon runner, you're like, great, I finished the marathon, and then you're like, oh, I gotta run another marathon. And that's pretty much what it is like to write a novel or write a book of any kind. When I finish a book, I'm like, yeah, oh, great, awesome. Now I can have 2 glasses of wine. And then the next day it's literally back to writing again. And you have to do that. For me, it's the notion that, it takes 10,000 hours to be really good at something. I think that's true. I think I did spend 10,000 hours writing without anybody caring about it. And if you were able to do that, if you can spend 10,000 hours doing something that no one will ever reward you for, no one will care whether you do this or not, whatever that is, you will be good at it. I can't guarantee that you'll be great at it, but you will be good at it. And so that was what it was like for me to be a writer. But Murakami goes a little bit further. Here's another metaphor where he says, it's like drilling into rock. You just pound and pound and pound and pound, and then eventually you might hit water. That's the moment, that's the mystery. That's the moment when you know whether you have any kind of inspiration, any kind of genius, any kind of spark inside of you, and there's no explaining it. The only thing that can be explained is the 10,000 hours. And if you can't do the 10,000 hours, then you can never access the mystery. Last example, we look at Simone Biles or LeBron James, and no one ever questions that those people do 10,000 hours. No one ever questions it. And you have to do that if you want to be a great athlete. But people look at artists and like, oh, you probably just go into your studio, or you go sit at your desk and you have a coffee or something, and then boom, you produce something amazing. That's just not true, I think, for most of us.
Well, I think people sort of know that it's very difficult to write, right? It's a kind of lonely job, and you have to sit down. I think people may think that art is easier, that somehow you get inspired and things come along. But it's also really hard work. I came to photography via biology. I didn't know what else to do, and as a child of refugees, my brother studied engineering. I didn't think I could hack that, so I studied biology thinking I would go to med school. Didn't get into med school. Someone said, oh, go back to school, do some research and apply again. And while I was doing all of that, back in school, I could take a non-science course, and I wanted to take drawings, filled up, so I took photography. And there was something about being able to go out and experience the world was so exciting to me. And I thought I was visual, but I didn't know how good I was, And yeah, it's a lot of hard work. It's about honing your craft. It's about really understanding what the masterful work is and what's good, what's not good. How do you find your voice? And I have to say that the event in Vietnam and that history helped me figure out, the last step of my craft. I think that if I didn't have that story to try to answer, not going back to Vietnam, not trying to understand what happened in the war, I don't think that my work as a landscape photographer would be the way it is today. This kind of way of working and thinking historically. But because of taking the steps that were about the unknown, really kind of forced me to step up and really kind of own my craft.
How do you know you have something original? Because we're all borrowing from each other. We all have muses. We're all inspired by something, someone, history, events. How do you know this is good?
I don't think that you can reinvent the wheel, but I don't think there's ever anything completely new. But it's about the way you write, about the way you show something, the different inflections, and people who are kind of knowledgeable can tell the difference, and it just feels fresh. And that's what original means. It doesn't mean brand new, out of the gate. It just means something different and something compelling, and in a way unique, because we all have unique histories, and we use that to kind of gain that perspective and gain that point of view.
I think each of us who becomes an artist or a writer has to become an expert on our subject, whatever that is. And if you become an expert on something, then you know what's original and what's not, what's tired and what's new. So if you want to be a writer, for example, you have to be a reader as well. In fact, being a reader is the first and foremost condition of being a writer. So you have to read a lot, and when you read a lot and you read deeply, then you start to recognize, you develop this sense of expertise and this sense of awareness of what's already been done, so you can do something different. You can do something different technically, and in terms of your subject matter and so on. But maybe the last thing, and this is, again, going back to your earlier question about how does one get good at what one does? At least for me as a writer, the metaphor that I used earlier was, a trap door opens underneath me and I'm overwhelmed with emotion. But most of us, I think, many of us don't want to open that trap door for very good reason, right? We don't want to be overwhelmed. We don't want to be trapped by our past. We don't want to go somewhere into the darkness that we've spent our lives trying to avoid. But I think, at least for me as a writer, and other writers I know, we have to open the trap door. We have to go into that darkness that terrifies us. We have to be able to confront what it is that hurts us and that we would rather keep hidden behind that door. So it takes a lot of, I don't know what it takes. I think it takes some emotional preparation, but for me, it also took the 10,000 hours of writing, learning the art and the technique, which also prepared me to open that door.
Can I say something? I actually, the kind of photography I do is very simple, Even though it's called art photography, it's not three-dimensional. It doesn't have superimposed color shifts and things that you may associate with art. It's not fuzzy, it's actually super sharp. So it's kind of very humble kind of photography. And I think in many ways, it's an imperfect parallel, but I think of the kind of photography I love is very much like literature and poetry. So it uses very humble materials, In writing, you have words and you have structures and sentences. Photography, it's about putting things in the world together and describing it, which is what you do in literature too. So within those structures, which are very restrictive, we try to do something new, something that is compelling. And I think it's a challenge, and I love that challenge, actually.
Whose opinion do you trust the most when you have a piece of work you want someone outside of you to take a look? Who do you two go to?
My wife. My wife Lan is also a poet, also from San Jose, also a Vietnamese refugee. I was very lucky to find her, and she was very unlucky that she became my first and last reader. So those 30 years of misery that most of you are spared from having to deal with in terms of my writing, she was reading all the drafts of my short stories, and they were terrible. But then, her job was to be honest, but also to be supportive. It's a very difficult combination. If any of you are involved with a writer, I'm sure you know how emotionally and perilous that relationship is. The writer wants you to be honest, but if you're too honest, the writer freaks out. So I recognize that me at least as a writer, is a difficult person to live with. So she's my first and last reader. And then after that, so for example, The Sympathizer, that book was rejected by 13 out of 14 publishers. The 14th editor in New York City who bought the book turned out to be the only person who was not an American. And he looks white, Peter Blackstock, but in fact he is mixed race. His mother is Indian Malaysian. He's the other most important person for me because he got the novel, and he's always been so supportive. He and my publisher Morgan Entrikin of Grove Atlantic, they let me do whatever I want to do. You know how hard that is as a writer? Being a writer is really a hard situation because if you write a book, you do what you want to do, and your book only sells a few hundred copies or a few thousand copies, your publisher is likely to drop you. But Grove Atlantic has stuck with me through all of my books, all of my arguments, all of my public manifestations and all of my controversies. So I'm also very grateful to have them as well.
Yeah, my main critic is also my husband. We met in graduate school in photography, and we had the same taste. And I can't say he always agrees with everything I do, but even when he disagrees and is critical of it, it kind of forces me to reconsider everything and come up with my own decisions. But I think we all have a little group of trusted quote-unquote advisors. I have an old friend who is a retired curator in photography, and I always bring work to her. For example, she's really sensitive to portraiture, which is something I'm not good with. And so when I started becoming interested in portraiture, I would bring her the work, and if she liked something, it felt like I had accomplished, that I was getting close to the goals. But I think we're grateful for having, that forum, the discussions. Sometimes my husband walks into the studio and he would see something like an object. I started working with objects and embroidery and things like that, and it's just sitting on the desk, and he would just walk by and say, "Oh, that's cool." I found these like humongous Zippo lighters that are made in Japan mostly, and they are, I don't know how many size larger than the little Zippos, and I thought, Zippo lighters are kind of fun. I love the inscriptions, but they just don't have the heft, they're not sculptural, they're not monumental. So I started buying some of those, and they were just sitting on my desk. I wasn't really sure what I would do with them, and he walked by and he said, "Oh, that's really cool." So I think just that alone kind of gave me the incentive to continue. Of course, there would be many more criticisms and feedback later, but that's a different story.
How much of the work is you doing the work alone and very lonely, and how much of your work is a team and other people elevating your work for you? I'm just curious.
Writing is such a lonely...
Writing is 99% alone in misery and all that kind of stuff. That's what I chose. Then the remaining 1% is the editor stepping in. Like, so for example, the sympathizer example, I gave Peter the manuscript he bought was, I think, like 170,000 words, and then he cut it down to 140,000, which I agree with. I mean, that losing those 30,000 words was fine. So that is important. And then of course, I have people here, helping me. So this part of the job, getting out of the room and putting the book out, and going out into the world to meet people, it's not my favorite part of the job. Thankfully, it's only 1% of the job, but it is necessary.
Well, my favorite thing is to be out in the world photographing, and no matter how hard I've had to work to gain access, to find the funding, to prepare for a trip, being out there photographing is the greatest thing. And I've worked mostly alone, and I have a lot of gear, a view camera, film plates and lenses and everything. And I think this is one thing that the MacArthur allowed me to do, was to hire an assistant to come along and help me carry the gear. And it just allowed me to work faster, not have a backache at the end of the day, going up and down the stairs, on aircraft carrier or whatever. But I think working with an assistant is great because you get companionship, but it kind of, opens you to someone else seeing your process, which it took me a little while to. It's sort of like if somebody stood next to you while you were writing, right? You feel like you can't think and you can't process things, but I got used to it, and I think it's actually great to have that companionship, because you have to be so social when you're out in the world, and sometimes when people see you with someone else, they may think twice before approaching you. I've been stuck on aircraft carriers where you would have to have dinner every night and someone would want to come and talk to you. But if you're with an assistant, it's a different story. But that's my favorite part of the work. Of course, we have to show work, have studio visits, and sometimes it's good, sometimes it's not that much fun. Lectures are not great for me, I think it's important to do them, but I tend not to do them. So I think that, definitely my work is not like a choreographer where I would be working with big groups of artists and dancers, but I'm not so lonely.
And I also, first of all, I just want to read the audience. How many of you have a question you would like to ask our speakers? Raise your hand so that then I'd have enough time. Okay, got a couple hands, thank you. I'm still gonna ask questions for a little while. The sympathizer was a revelation for a lot of people, myself included, because it's about a man with two mindsets, and it was a very different narrative. And I am curious, because you write fiction and nonfiction, And does fiction give you more freedom, or does it give you more pressure to grapple with contradictions than memoir or essay?
I would have said fiction until I wrote A Man of Two Faces, which is a memoir. And I never wanted to write a memoir because when I was growing up, I thought my life is not interesting. It's my parents' lives who had gone through these epic experiences in Vietnamese history that was interesting. So I sort of backed into the memoir, and then I wrote A Man of Two Faces. And let me just say, I hope none of you ever feel the need to write a memoir. Because if you do, it means something terrible has happened to you, or something terrible has happened to people very close to you. But then the problem is that if you want to write a memoir, you have to be truthful. You have to be truthful. You have to be utterly truthful to the extent that you know yourself. That means that you have to possibly betray other people who may not want their stories to be told, but their stories intersect with your stories, like my parents did. And then what the saving grace out of all of that is that if you betray other people, you also need to betray yourself. No one wants to read an account where you only betray other people, unless it's Mark Zuckerberg or Donald Trump, and I betray them. But if you're just a normal person and you're writing a memoir, you also have to betray yourself. So when A Man of Two Faces was about to come out, and I was beginning to share, before it came out, I was beginning to share the manuscript in workshop settings with people, the first people to read it besides my wife, I actually felt physically sick. This has never happened to me as a writer. Writing can be very challenging in different ways, and it can be terrifying to bring a book into the world, if it's a novel, for example. But I felt physically sick, like I am going to expose my guts to these people, even either strangers or even friends. And not just me, but my mother, her story as well. What right do I have to tell her story? And what would people think if I exposed myself and betrayed myself? So, and actually, writing that memoir was the writing of it was not scary in and of itself necessarily, but bringing it out into the world and knowing that people would read these stories about my family and about me, that was really, really a difficult process for me. That being said, I think people still turn to novels first. Fiction still has a grip on people's imaginations that other genres in writing don't necessarily have. And I think it's because we still live with this idea that the novel is a form of great entertainment, and it's a form of great truth-telling, it's a form of dealing with history and everything else. And so people still look forward to novels almost more than anything else, I think. So I still retain that idea as well, that the book that people still wait to hear the most from me is still going to be the next novel.
Thank you. And your mediums are just so different. We have literature, photography, and I'm just curious what you see in each other's work that resonates, with your own craft.
I'll start, because I have a lot to say about Emily's work, actually. And as I brought a book for her to sign, Small Wars, and as I opened it, I realized, she'd already signed it back in 2006, which was when I first met her in Los Angeles as she was talking about that book. And I was immediately attracted to her work because I'm very familiar with Vietnam War photography. I've seen a lot of it. And her work in Small Wars does reference that, but also goes way beyond that. If you haven't seen Small Wars, go get it. It's a brilliant idea. And it's about, photographing these Americans who were reenacting the Vietnam War. So most of us are familiar with having Americans reenact the Civil War, World War II, and so on. But this idea of reenacting the Vietnam War, that was really, really interesting. It's sort of a stroke of genius for Anmi to use that as her subject. But and then there's one famous photograph in that book that I've written about, I think, where you pose yourself as a Viet Cong sniper aiming at these American soldiers. Someone else is photographing you. And I thought, that's a really brilliant photograph, with the photographer putting herself into the photo, but also as the Viet Cong, right? That is so layered of an arrangement there. And then if you go, I follow Emily's work. It's really interesting and very diverse. But the work that she has done around the military and the war machine and so on, I think is really, really brilliant. And yes, maybe it's very highly technical in a way that I can't really articulate. However, the project of engaging with our military industrial complex as a subject is enormously compelling. And it's not the photography you see in the New York Times or wherever with our soldiers in the desert doing whatever they're going to do, right? those kind of photographs still affirm this idea that these are our soldiers, this is our military, and we need to support them no matter how horrible it is, how horrible the war is. And that kind of war photography still falls in the vein of the war is hell genre, right? Like we watch war movies, we see war photographs, and we think war is hell, and war is hell, and then we go fight wars again. I don't think Annie's photography does that, even though it references some of that, obviously, because some of the content of some of the photographs is about the war machine. But the fact is that, for me, the profound truth of her photographs is that they speak to how we are all living in a war machine. And it's banal. I mean, the photographs of some of the works is like, sailors and soldiers on aircraft carriers, or they're just in their uniforms doing their daily jobs. There's nothing very glamorous, there's nothing dramatic about it. And that's exactly what it is like to live in a war machine. We're acclimated to life in a war machine. The hum of the war machine, that's just a part of our daily existence. We don't think twice about the fact that our tax dollars are going into the war machine. And not just aircraft carriers and the tanks and so on, but also, of course, our entire society is built around that. Like our technology is completely tied in to the technology of the war machine. We wouldn't have an iPhone if it wasn't for the war machine, things like that, or the internet. So I think that's how I read her photography, besides its technical brilliance and admittedly the beauty of the photographs as well. I mean, I actually find the war machine very beautiful. That's part of the paradox, and many war veterans and war writers have commented about this. Like war is ugly, as Tim O'Brien has said, and war is nasty, he says, and war is fun. And Michael Hurst in Dispatches said you gotta admire the machinery of these American helicopters as they're shooting their rockets and killing people. And so I think that her photographs don't do that, but they capture the banality and the beauty of this gigantic complex in which we live.
Well, I'm a visual artist, and I think that Viet expresses brilliantly some of the things I think about in my messy mind so eloquently in his writing and also in his public speaking. And that's why I admire his work so much, and I'm always so thrilled to be up to date to what he's doing. Yeah, and I have to say, when Viet first approached me, I was working on the Vietnam War reenactments, and I felt really confused. I knew it was important. I couldn't make sense out of it. My kids were little. I was a real mess. And he started writing about it, and I think it gave me the confidence that I was onto something. And I will always be very grateful for that. But I think it's just that I think about so many things, and perhaps my photograph explained it, but Viet writes about it eloquently. All the paradoxes, all the ambiguities, the complexities of politics and culture and identity, and I think especially you also speak about it very eloquently, and I really, really admire and appreciate that.
Thank you. That made me feel so good. Okay, so we had a couple questions for you. You were the first one that I saw. Can you stand up, tell us your name, speak loudly? We might have to repeat your question.
No, yeah. I'm gonna put that there. All right.
Okay.
There we go. Introduce yourself.
Hi, my name is Phil. So from listening to the both of you share, I can get the sense that you have confidence from the experience and skills of expressing your voice. I guess what I'm wondering is, I find that expressing one's voice in one's profession can build much easier over time. Do you find yourself being able to find your voice personally, in your personal lives, and being able to transfer that confidence? Because as a Vietnamese American, I find it really challenging to find my voice on the personal level, like with my family and friends.
What do you mean by finding your voice?
So to express and communicate clearly, personally, on a personal level, and finding that gap. So as an educator, in my profession, I actually feel pretty confident with expressing my voice and sharing my knowledge. But with my parents, with my family, with the way I see myself as a woman, much more challenging to express my voice on the personal level.
You think they may not see you for who you are?
I think I'm scared
within yourself.
Yes, so I want to pick your brain regarding whether you're able to transfer your professional confidence in expressing your voice in your personal life.
Well, I think you should give them a chance, right? My parents were devastated when I decided to forego medical school. I did get into medical school, and I said no, and embarked on this thing that, I had no job, I took one photography class, audited one, and got kicked out of another one. And then, like, what kind of future, right? But then and I got a lot of support from women curators and, who are interested in, I guess, my fluency in photography. So I was included in this, it's called New Photography at the Museum of Modern Art, 1997. And my mom, my brother came to the opening, and I heard my mom say to someone else, well, if Annie had become a doctor, we won't have these pictures today, But that's her speaking to someone else and not to me. And I know that she worried about me and how I would make it until the day she died. And she, even though we got MacArthur, I'm a tenured professor, yeah. But I think you should give them a chance.
That's a really hard question, actually. I'm a very confrontational person in my books and in my writing and in my lectures. Okay, I have no problem saying what I say to people. In my own family with my parents, I never deviated from what it is that they wanted from me. I think I always did exactly what they told me to do. And then my brother said, no, they think you're the black sheep of the family. But it was always, for me, like, your question is poignant because I never felt that I could really explicitly speak out in the family context for everything that I believed in. Because I respected my parents so much, even if I resented them in some ways as well, because our beliefs differed from each other in some very important ways. So I never wanted to trouble them. I never wanted to say, hey, you believe this, but I believe this. And to this day, both my parents have passed away. To this day, I don't know for sure whether they ever really knew what I believed in. I mean, they knew I became a professor, right? And that was a transgression enough as it was, because my brother became a doctor, which is what I was supposed to do. But I became a professor, and the saving grace was I had a job at a university. So at least I had that title. But I think the first time they realized I was going to be a writer was when I brought home to my father my first short story that had been translated into Vietnamese. And this short story was about a Vietnamese refugee who came to the United States in 1975, ends up in San Francisco, and discovers he is gay. And there's gay sex in this short story. My father took the translation, and we never talked about it again. So to this day, I have no idea whether he read that story or not. Let's assume that he did read the short story. And then he thought, we will never talk about this again. And I thought, we will never talk about this again. And we were both happy. And to me, that's one kind of happiness in a Vietnamese context. Everybody agrees not to talk about the thing that they possibly know exists. And if everybody agrees to do that, everybody can be happy, and then everybody can go off and do exactly what they want to do, and everything's great. That strategy doesn't work for everybody, I get that. But it works for some of us, and it kept my family happy, given my own inclinations, because my parents are devout Vietnamese Catholics, capitalists, and look at me, I came out almost exactly the opposite. But I think what can hopefully bind us together is that I felt that in the end, even though I did things very differently than what my parents wanted, in the end I still think I'm their son, because the values that they instilled in me of sacrifice, of struggle, of justice, all those things that came out of their background are exactly what I inherited. I've just chosen to do them in my way, right? And so hopefully that is the important lesson to learn. If you can't reconcile that, like the value systems, then there's a real problem. But simply because you chose a different path in some ways, politically or personally or whatever, that's not the end of the world. It's really when your worldviews are so distinctly different that you can't reconcile them in any way, that becomes really, really troubling.
I think something also you taught me in my first interview with you, like years ago, was you talked about just acknowledging filial piety. So many of us, we have this filial piety in our culture, and we don't want to hurt our parents. We have a certain image of ourselves that we want to maintain for them. They have an image of themselves they want to maintain for us too. But it is possible to observe filial piety and also share your work. And you know, I'll just say, my mother's like, "Take off, war, you know," and it's like, "Don't baby, more yak," you know, like I don't know what she's doing. And I just kind of like throw it back to her. I'm like, "Bye, ma'am." You know, like you listened to this at home throughout my childhood, you know, so now I like it. So I blame you, you know, and she doesn't say anything. So.
But I think it's clear to them that you are happy and that you love what you do and you kind of, you know, and they may not talk about it, but, you know, it's understated. And they're proud of you.
Over here, in the front, we had a
I have
question.
a question for Anne Lay, but I think Viet Thanh answered it. But I'll ask anyway. We're talking about art form, and both of you look at the war from a critical point of view. And I wanted to ask you, and you, does it ever, is there a conflict in your mind that maybe through your art and your critical perspective, you may be glorifying war in some way, or the warrior for that matter? I think visually is probably a little more prevalent because as a society we're becoming more visual. Does that happen? Or maybe that's not even a conflict.
But I think Viet answered it, you know. The war machinery is awesome, quote unquote. You know, I grew up with a bunch of boys, and the idea of riding in a jet would be so exciting. You know, having a jet land on an aircraft carrier, or I was in one of those messenger planes. You know, going from 200 miles an hour to 0 in 2 seconds. That's extraordinary. So why deny that, right? Because I think my goal was to try to tackle the subject in a non-reductive form, right? It would be easy to just say war is bad, the military is bad, and just make it look awful, and tilt my camera all the time, not look at proportion, make it out of focus, you know, and only look at things that are destructive. But I decided that it was okay to just accept what I felt, and it was a mixture of being in awe, and some of it is beautiful, some of it is tedious, some of it is outrageous, and you know, it's also visual, right? And I go by short titles. So my work is kind of misunderstood, and that's okay. So, I understand your question, and I embrace all of that. And you know, my work has been seen in conservative milieu as pro-war, glorifying war completely, and it has also been seen on the East Coast as being anti-war, so it kind of, so I'm not being passive-aggressive by not giving you a point of view. My goal is to provide an experience for you to think about those things, and so I'm grateful that you feel this way, you're questioning me, but it's about trying to embrace all of it in its contradiction.
We love being misunderstood. I think, you know, most people would, you know, probably know me from the novel The Sympathizer, right? But even in that novel, I try to resist what it is that you describe, because the last fifth of the novel is about a person being tortured from his own point of view. Now that's a kind of a controversial ending because, you know, some people get it, and then some people are like, oh, the novel goes off the rails at the end. The reason they think the novel goes off the rails at the end, I think, is because they want the more conventional novel, which is exactly what you're describing. War is a spectacle. And then the Sympathizer refuses that by putting you in the perspective of someone who's being tortured. There's nothing glamorous about that, and it's very uncomfortable. But you know, I think of my own work, when I think of my writing, as a lifelong project. And that, you know, if you read my other books, I think it would be extremely difficult to come away thinking that there's a glorification of war or a glorification of the spectacle of war or anything like that, whether it's the Vietnam War or something else. So I wrote a book called Nothing Ever Dies, Vietnam in the Memory of War, in which I challenged the very idea that this war is only about Vietnam and the United States. I wrote the sequel to The Sympathizer is The Committed. It's set in France. It takes on French colonization. Everybody who's obsessed about the American war in Vietnam would like, oh, you know, why would we read a novel set in France? They're not interested in the larger project that I see my work is engaged in, which is about decolonization, right? So in other words, the readers and the viewers have to be held responsible. Those readers and viewers who want the spectacle of war, who want to think of Vietnam only as a war, I can't help them. I'm not responsible for those people. If they would just read The Committed, which some of my readers think is actually better than The Sympathizer, they would see that there's a total argument against what the possibility that you described. But again, this goes back to the original framing of our conversation. We as Vietnamese refugees in the United States are still framed by the Vietnam War, whether we want to be or not, right? And so it takes so much effort for us to push back against that and challenge that notion. But at the same time, that means people have to be willing to listen to us, which so many people are not. I'm not saying you, Al, are not doing that. I'm just saying in the larger context, this country is still hung up on the Vietnam War.
But the Vietnam War is the starting point for us. You know, when I think we've gone without, I'm interested in conflict that is going on now in the United States. I think war has come home here, and that's what I'm exploring right now.
Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, first of all, it's an honor to meet both of you. Right. So I have one disagreement and agreement. First of all, I disagree that you said you're not a genius. So it's not fair to say you're not a genius. I believe that a lot of us think you're a genius. So I take it. Okay. Second of all, about Vietnamese are loud. I agree, you're very loud. So I have two questions. The first question is, I'm confused, right? As a Vietnamese American, I escaped out in 1978 as 15 years old. I have grandchildren now, first time granddad, and I don't know exactly what this Vietnamese American means. So the definition of Vietnam is very confusing, very controversial, right? So the Vietnam that I grew up, I know is dead. So there's no such thing as Vietnam anymore. So Vietnam War is horrible names of Vietnam War. It's not the Vietnam War, Vietnam, right? So I hate it every time I hear Vietnam War, right? It has nothing to do with Vietnam itself. So as you mentioned, the younger generation Vietnamese or whatever, right? So there's a communist Vietnam existing there. Who won the war? So what is Vietnam? The Vietnam that I know is dead. Nothing exists anymore. And the Vietnam here is the enemy, right? I hate all of them because they are communists, they kill my country. But the girl, Vietnamese girl, flying the space and she go like, oh, the first thing I want to say, hello Vietnam, I love Vietnam. Her parents come out of Vietnam who was destroyed by the Vietnam, she say hello right now and make me sick, right? And the Vietnam that I know was betrayed by the US foreign policy. US just betrayed Vietnam badly, allowed the Vietnamese communists to kill it. So every time in April 30th, I'm sick and tired of seeing American betrayed Vietnam never being recognized as, you guys, the Americans, have betrayed South Vietnam, make us die. So why don't we just keep saying to America, like we have an American flag and Vietnamese flag together as an ally? But no, America destroyed South Vietnam there. It's just horrible. President Diem didn't want him, the Americans to come in, they kill him. Americans come in, nobody invited them, they betray Vietnam, they withdraw, they let us die. So my question to you is, do you think that we all loud enough to say, fuck you America, you guys destroy us, you betray us? And we thank you for the time we are refugees, yes, but that's nothing with the crime you betray us. So why can't we just say, don't put American flag next to Vietnamese flag like we're still allies? No, you guys assholes, you destroy us, you are murderers. You destroy South Vietnam. So make it clear on April 30th. I don't think we're clear enough in all our discussion. In our debate, our creativity writing, that saying Americans are horrible. You guys make a crime. You destroy South Vietnam by betrayers. That's number one.
I think we should stop right there, because that's a big topic to get into. You know, I was really struck by when the fall of Kabul happened, that the New York Times Magazine did a whole article on South Vietnamese veterans and their reactions to the fall of Kabul. And these were all, you know, men in their 70s and 80s who were veterans, and for the first time in English, I saw Vietnamese veterans saying, Americans betrayed us. And what's happening in Kabul and Afghanistan is very similar to what's happened in South Vietnam. So I think maybe there is, like you asked about the 50 years and what does it mean, I think there's more of a shift where people are willing to say even the word betrayal, but you went beyond that, you went beyond that. And that's what I would say in my own work, you know. But I will go to, and I think you're right, I think these kinds of political sentiments have been suppressed for a long time, both because of American nationalism and patriotism, but also Vietnamese gratitude, Vietnamese refugee gratitude and Vietnamese anti-communism, all of that suppresses some of the real diversity of feeling in the Vietnamese refugee community that includes sentiments like yours. But let me just end on a more optimistic note, which is that, you know, the younger generation doesn't have to feel obligated by this burden in the same way. And I'll illustrate this by saying that I teach at USC, and we've had our controversies over exactly how to think about the past when it comes to the Vietnam War. There was a time about 15 years ago when somebody realized that among all the international flags shown at USC, the one representing Vietnam was the red flag, not the yellow flag. And so then a Vietnamese activist came from Orange County and stapled the yellow flag on top of the red flag. That became an issue, obviously. And so my colleagues and I had a meeting with the Vietnamese students on campus, and there was a Vietnamese student association, all Vietnamese Americans who were children and grandchildren of refugees, and Vietnamese international students. And they got together, and the Vietnamese international students said, we understand your pain, it's time to move on from the past, let's be friends. And the Vietnamese American students said, no, we can't, because we still feel our parents suffering, and we can't move on from the past. That's what it means to be a loser versus a winner, I think. But now, in the last couple of years, I've been invited back by the Vietnamese Student Association to talk about Black April. And interestingly enough, this student association now has Vietnamese Americans and Vietnamese international students. And they don't care about this issue emotionally. They care about it intellectually, which they have me come out to talk about the history with them. And then when that's over, the two of these groups are like, okay, let's have boba now. I mean, literally, that's what they do. And so I think that's actually kind of hopeful that a new generation, some of them do want to understand the past historically, politically, and all of its complexity, but without the recriminations of your generation and my generation. And then they want to have boba and move on. Now, whether we like that or not, that's sort of the reality of things. I don't know about that. I mean, like the Vietnamese American students still obviously, well, you're right there. The Vietnamese American community as a whole has a very hard time saying Americans might have or did betray South Vietnam. That is very hard for a lot of Vietnamese Americans to do. That's a different kind of work than the work of reconciliation. For Vietnamese Americans to recognize that that happened, I think they have to have the capacity to also acknowledge that Americans have betrayed numerous other countries as well. Once you break past the ideological barrier that prevents you from saying the United States betrayed South Vietnam, then you're able to say, oh, the United States betrayed Afghanistan too. The United States betrayed all these other countries as well. So that's a whole different step that goes way beyond the question of reconciliation. I think we have another question somewhere over there.
You want to take one more? Because we also need to. One more. Okay. All right.
I think we should have one from Duan Huang.
Okay.
I just want to point out Duan Huang here. You came late. You were Vietnamese. You came late. Because we started on time. And you missed the fact that I spoke about the Netflix documentary of which Duan Huang was the filmmaker. There's a definite producer, and let me just say, this might be one of the first documentaries or mainstream productions where our Vietnamese names appear with diacritics. I was so moved to see that there are diacritics on everybody's names, and all the Vietnamese place names, and for once it made it easy for those of us who are not completely fluent to understand how to pronounce these names and these places in our language. Congratulations on the documentary.
And the series is in the top 10 for Netflix.
It peaks at number 3, but I wanted to say that in episode 5, it does clearly say how the Americans betrayed South Vietnam, and you see it from Teal's like perspective. You see many people talking about it. So watch episode 5 if you want to see the betrayal. But what I wanted to ask you is like as artists who are working, you know, as Vietnamese American artists, you have the past of the parents and the pain and of what happened to, you know, the other older generation's pain. And then you also have your own Americanness that, you know, puts you in a different position, a different perspective. And I mean, for me, I felt like I could never please all sides. Like there's myself and myself as an artist. There's, you know, like one of my parents' friends say, I don't want to see your series because there's a communist talking in it. You know, like they, and I'm like, well, they were in the war, you know, and but you know, it's like dealing, like balancing those things of your the other generations. I think there's more pressure on us in general as the second or 1.5 generation. But then on top of that, you know, it's kind of like you're if you get out there, you're considered a voice for your people. But is that, you know, how do you balance that in yourself and your own work of how, you know, like artistically, do you choose to just go forward with whatever comes out of you and just say F it, or, you know, do you consider, you know, the expectations from both of your cultures?
I have to say that I work very selfishly. I have questions and I just go for it. I don't think about my audience. I think my father still doesn't know I dressed up like a Vietnam and all these reenactments. It's really shocking, right? So yeah, I'm really selfish, and I think that it's good to consider your audience. Perhaps once you start your project, and you want to shape it a little bit, but I really don't worry so much.
I think as a writer, you have to be selfish. I think you have to be absolutely authentic to what it is you believe in, and you can't compromise on your vision and your voice, because if you compromise, the work is weaker, the work is lesser. And then you put the work out, and then you deal with the consequences. You deal with being misunderstood, you deal with people liking it or hating the work, and so on and so forth. But that's different from the question of how one behaves as a person in the world, you know. So as a writer, I do everything for myself, but as a person in the world, I try to foment community. I try to, be in dialogue with other people. I try to build artistic organizations and so on. And that is also something that is open to all of us. You know, this whole idea of the genius that was brought up earlier, the genius, the reason why I think it's a problematic concept is because it tempts people into bad behavior. Like, oh, I'm a genius, I can do anything I want. And you know, that's what leads to like the Me Too stuff and all that. So it's important to have an ethical sense of one's role as an artist in the world and what one owes to other people. Because I recognize that I wouldn't be a writer, ironically, if it wasn't for my parents. My parents didn't realize as they were sacrificing themselves at the Saigon Mud that they were raising one of the most dangerous creatures you can find in your house. A writer! You know, an inherent betrayer of your secrets. But I recognize that I'm a part of this community that nurtured me and raised me, from my parents to the Vietnamese refugee community to the fact that there have been Asian American writers since the late 19th century. So that when I came along, it wasn't a completely alien thing to have an Asian American writing a book. Now, Duan, you're a producer in a TV series. I mean, on a TV series, but you're a filmmaker as well. And it's difficult. You know, you have to have your purity of your artistic vision, and then you have to reconcile with your collaborators and everything like that. And so that ethical sense still holds true, because when we adapted the sympathizer for TV for the HBO Max series, the most important thing I could do was have a set of principles. Like I said, this is going to be mostly in Vietnamese. We did that. This is going to be mostly with Vietnamese actors. We did that. And this will be mostly faithful to the book. And we did that. And we did that because we chose the right people to work with. And so if you have to collaborate, then you have to choose the right people who share the same values that you do. And that's how you try to maintain the purity of your vision in the world.
Thank you so much, Viet Thanh Nguyen and Ami Lay. And thank you to the audience for your very thoughtful questions. Let's clear a path and let these two get to the table so that they can start signing books. So I know you have a lot of questions for them, but please